Picture the Wild West. You're probably seeing a lone hero, hand hovering over his coat, ready for a high noon duel. You imagine the crack of gunfire, the dramatic fall, and the town cheering. That's the West of the movies, a world of righteous violence and heroic last stands. But what you don't imagine is the smell. The overpowering stench of human and animal waste baking in the sun. The thick, foul cocktail of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and tobacco spit that hung in every saloon. You don't imagine the metallic tang of the water you just drank. Water that was drawn from a well just 50 feet from an overflowing outhouse. It's swimming with cholera, and it's far more likely to kill you before lunch than any outlaw's bullet. The heroic gunfight is a fantasy. The reality is that you wouldn't last 10 seconds in the Wild West, not because of outlaws, but because of the invisible killers you'd meet before a single shot was ever fired. The real fight for survival wasn't against other men. It was against a world of filth, disease, and staggering ignorance that claimed lives with a speed Hollywood never dares to show. Forget the OK Corral. The real gamble was surviving your own dinner plate, your neighbor's cough, and the water at the bottom of the well. While gunfights were a real danger, they were statistically insignificant compared to the microscopic predators stalking every town and wagon train. Life expectancy on the frontier was brutally short, somewhere between 35 and 45 years old. And it wasn't lead that brought most people down, it was disease. The number one killer in the 1800s wasn't a bullet, it was Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the bacteria that causes consumption. And right behind it were other horrors: cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox, which could turn boomtowns into mass graves overnight. The romantic image of the lone cowboy is just that, an image. The reality was a grim, short, and often disgusting struggle to exist. So, if you're into digging up the grimy reality behind the myths, you're in the right place. We're about to get our hands dirty, and trust me, it's not a pretty sight. The single greatest threat to your life in the Old West wasn't an outlaw, it was the water. In the dusty boontowns, any water source was a lifeline, but it was almost always a poisoned one. The problem was a complete lack of understanding of germ theory. The idea that invisible organisms could transmit deadly diseases was decades away from being common knowledge. So, town wells were often dug wherever it was convenient, frequently downhill from the town's outhouses or the local livery stable. Think about that. Every privy pit, every pile of horse manure was constantly leaching a toxic superbacteria straight into the community's drinking water. The streets themselves were basically open sewers. There was no garbage collection. Butchers tossed animal guts into the alley. People threw household waste right into the street, and everywhere there were animals, horses, mules, pigs, and their manure piled up relentlessly. In the gold rush town of Dawson, the main street was so foul that a man famously won a bet by crossing it, not by wading through the filth, but by hopping from one frozen horse carcass to the next. That wasn't an exception, it was the norm. When it rained, the streets turned into a thick, putrid sludge. When the sun baked down, this filth dried into a fine powder that the wind whipped into the air, coating everything and everyone. You breathed it in, it got in your food, and it settled back into the water sources. Every sip, every bite was a roll of the dice. This created the perfect breeding ground for waterborne diseases, the true apex predators of the frontier. The most feared was Asiatic cholera. Known as the unseen destroyer, cholera was terrifying for its speed. A person could feel fine at breakfast, drink some contaminated water, and be dead by evening. The symptoms were violent. It started with stomach cramps that escalated into unbearable pain, followed by severe diarrhea and vomiting that could drain the body of its fluids in hours. Victims' skin turned cold and bluish-gray as they rapidly dehydrated to death. On the great overland trails, cholera cut through wagon trains without warning. The epidemic peaked in the early 1850s, fueled by the gold rush. It thrived in the unsanitary conditions where parties would camp on the same ground, littered with the waste of those who came before. Entire families could be wiped out in days. A letter from one pioneer in 1852 grimly recounts, "You see, we have lost 7 persons in a few short days, all died of cholera." Historians estimate that during the peak of the migration, as many as 4,000 to 5,000 emigrants died from this one disease alone, with an overall mortality rate as high as 1 in 10 travelers on the Oregon Trail. The biggest dangers were not ambushes, but disease and accidents. Some parts of the trail west of the Missouri River became known as the Trail of the Dead, with some stretches having 10 to 15 graves for every mile. Alongside cholera was its vicious cousin, dysentery, often called the bloody flux. This intestinal inflammation caused severe bloody diarrhea and fever, spreading through the same contaminated food and water. Then there was typhoid fever, which presented with similar symptoms, but also intense headaches and a swollen abdomen. It was a slower killer, but just as effective in an era without antibiotics. They saw thousands perish from the unseen destroyer, but they never saw the true killer, the microscopic organisms in the water they drank every single day. They were fighting a war against an enemy they couldn't see, and they were losing. If the water was trying to kill you, your daily environment was its willing accomplice. The Wild West wasn't just dirty, it was a sensory assault of grime, pests, and smells. Let's start with the heart of any frontier town, the saloon. In movies, it's a place of high drama. In reality, it was a public health nightmare. The floor was usually covered in sawdust to absorb spills and, more disgustingly, the constant stream of tobacco spit. Spittoons were there, but accuracy wasn't a priority. The floor was a foul, damp mat of dirt, liquor, mud, and chewing tobacco that was rarely, if ever, changed. The free lunch, a staple in many saloons, was a buffet of potential food poisoning, with meat and cheese sitting out for hours, swarmed by flies that had just come from the horse manure in the street. The home offered little escape. Many pioneers lived in soddies, houses made of sod blocks with dirt floors. They were dark, leaky, and often shared with snakes, bugs, and rodents. To keep the dust down, some homesteaders would just pour used, greasy dishwater onto the ground, creating a septic, grimy surface. Even in wooden cabins, cleanliness was a losing battle. Without window screens, flies and mosquitoes moved freely from outdoor waste to indoor food. Personal hygiene was, by our standards, appalling. But this was partly because of strange cultural beliefs and logistical challenges. For much of the 19th century, many believed that excessive bathing was unhealthy because it washed away the body's protective oils and opened the pores to disease. Even if you wanted a bath, it was an immense chore. Water had to be hauled by hand and heated over a fire. This made a full bath a rare luxury. To conserve water and effort, the whole family would often bathe in the same tub of water, one after another. The father went first, then the mother, then the children, with the baby bathing last in what was by then a tepid, murky soup. Body odor was just a fact of life. People tried to mask it with herbs or tobacco smoke. The first modern commercial deodorant you'd recognize, a cream called Mum, wasn't introduced until 1888. And what about the bathroom? Indoor plumbing was a distant dream. For everyone else, there was the outhouse, a simple pit in the ground with a shed over it. They were smelly, swarming with flies, and a primary source of water contamination. As for toilet paper, that's another modern invention. Before commercially produced toilet paper arrived in the late 19th century, people used whatever was on hand: leaves, grass, corn cobs, or pages torn from a Sears catalog. This constant, intimate contact with filth meant survival was a numbers game. The rugged cowboy of the silver screen would have, in reality, been a walking ecosystem of bacteria and parasites, always just one wrong sip of water away from an agonizing death. If you got sick or injured in the Old West, your problems were just beginning. Going to a doctor was a 50-50 gamble. The medical field was a chaotic mess of well-meaning ignorance, dangerous theories, and outright quackery. Again, the biggest problem was the absence of germ theory. A doctor might perform an amputation, wipe his bloody hands on an old rag, and then go deliver a baby. Surgical instruments were rarely cleaned, let alone sterilized. Doctors operated in their street clothes on kitchen tables. A simple cut from barbed wire could easily lead to a fatal infection. The doctors themselves varied wildly in skill. Some were educated, but many had only a brief apprenticeship. In remote areas, the local doctor was often just the town barber or blacksmith, whose main qualification was owning tools that could pull teeth or set bones. Dental care was a special kind of nightmare. There was no real dentistry, only extraction. If you had a toothache, the tooth was pulled, usually without anesthesia, using brutal pliers or a terrifying tool called a tooth key. The dentist would clamp on and twist until it came out, often breaking the jaw or leaving infected roots behind. Treatments for disease were based on ancient, wrong ideas about the body's humors. Doctors used bloodletting, draining blood from patients who were already weak. They applied blistering agents to the skin, believing it would draw the sickness out. Patients were also given powerful drugs to induce vomiting or diarrhea, further dehydrating those already suffering from diseases like cholera. Into this medical void stepped the patent medicine trade, traveling medicine shows, hawked miracle cure, alls for everything from cancer to baldness. These tonics were, of course, a sham. Their makers weren't required to list the ingredients. The active ingredient that made people feel better was often a large dose of alcohol, opium, morphine, or even cocaine. These were highly addictive, ensuring repeat customers. One popular infant soother was loaded with opium. Even Coca-Cola started as a patent medicine containing coca leaves, the source of cocaine. Some of the most dangerous remedies contained mercury or arsenic, and at the tail end of the era, some even included radioactive elements like radium. Even a correct diagnosis was no guarantee. Consumption, or tuberculosis, was the leading killer. The famous gunman Doc Holliday, a dentist by trade, didn't die in a blaze of glory. He wasted away in a bed from tuberculosis at the age of 36. For years, he suffered from a constant racking cough and depended on alcohol and laudanum, an opium tincture, just to get through the day. When faced with the true killers, bacteria and viruses, the doctors were armed with little more than good intentions and bad ideas. The cures were often deadlier than the diseases. Your best hope was to simply not get sick, which was nearly impossible in a world so saturated with death. And then, of course, there was violence. The part Hollywood actually gets close to, but still manages to sanitize. Forget the clean, cinematic duel at high noon. Real violence in the Wild West was chaotic, fast, and usually unfair. There were no dramatic countdowns, no honorable standoffs. Most shootings happened in the dark, fueled by alcohol, rage, or fear. You wouldn't be facing a calm opponent across the street. You'd be dealing with a drunk man whose hand was already on the trigger before you even knew there was a problem. Gunfights weren't about skill, they were about surprise. Many victims never even saw who shot them. A disagreement over a card game, an insult taken the wrong way, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could end your life instantly. Saloons, already breeding grounds for disease, doubled as pressure cookers for violence. Mix alcohol, weapons, and fragile egos, and you don't get duels, you get explosions. And even if you survived being shot, your chances weren't much better. A bullet wound in the Old West was often a death sentence, not because of the injury itself, but because of what came after. Infection. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, even a minor wound could turn gangrenous. The bullet didn't have to kill you. The bacteria would finish the job slowly, painfully, and inevitably. Imagine this: you get grazed in the arm. It doesn't seem fatal. But within days, the wound swells, turns black, and the pain becomes unbearable. Fever sets in. Your body begins to shut down. If you're lucky, they amputate, without proper sterilization, without effective anesthesia, on a dirty table. That's if a doctor is even available. More often, people just waited and died. Violence wasn't heroic. It was messy, terrifying, and almost always pointless. Even lawmen, the supposed symbols of order, weren't safe. Being a sheriff didn't make you a protector, it made you a target. Many lawmen lasted only months before being killed. The badge didn't grant authority, it painted a bullseye on your chest. And then there were the everyday dangers that didn't involve guns at all. Knives, fists, blunt objects, accidents. Bar fights could turn lethal in seconds. A shove, a fall, a cracked skull on a wooden floor, and it was over. No ambulances, no emergency rooms. Just a crowd watching as someone slowly slipped away. Even something as simple as riding a horse could kill you. Horses were unpredictable, easily spooked, and incredibly dangerous. A fall could break your neck instantly, or worse, leave you injured and unable to move, stranded miles from help. And help, in most cases, wasn't coming. Out on the frontier, isolation was its own kind of death sentence. If something went wrong, there was no one to call, no backup, no safety net. You were entirely on your own in a world that was actively trying to kill you. So when people imagine the Wild West as this thrilling playground of danger and adventure, they're missing the truth. It wasn't thrilling. It was relentless. Violence wasn't rare. It was unpredictable. And unpredictability is what makes survival nearly impossible. You couldn't prepare for it. You couldn't outskill it. You couldn't even see it coming half the time. You wouldn't last 10 seconds, not because you couldn't fight, but because the fight would already be over before you even realized it had begun. Even if you somehow avoided disease, filth, bad medicine, and sudden violence, you still had to face something far more powerful, the land itself. The Wild West wasn't just wild because of outlaws, it was wild because it was completely indifferent to human life. It didn't care how strong you were, how smart you were, or how badly you wanted to survive. It would kill you the same way it killed everyone else, slowly, brutally, and without warning. Start with the heat. In the summer, temperatures in parts of the frontier could climb well above 40 degrees Celsius, 24 degrees Celsius. There was no air conditioning. No refrigeration. Shade was limited, especially on open plains or desert trails. You were exposed constantly, riding for hours under a relentless sun that drained your body of water faster than you could replace it. And remember, your water source was probably already contaminated. So now you're faced with a choice: die of dehydration or risk drinking water that could kill you just as quickly. Heat stroke wasn't rare, it was expected. Your body overheats, your vision blurs, your muscles fail, and then your organs begin shutting down. If you collapse out there, there's no rescue team coming. No one even knows where you are. You just disappear. Now flip the season. Winter on the frontier was just as deadly, but in the opposite way. Freezing temperatures, blizzards, and icy winds could kill within hours. Without proper insulation, your body loses heat rapidly. Fingers and toes go numb, then black. Frostbite sets in, hypothermia follows. And the most dangerous part? You don't even realize it's happening. Hypothermia clouds your thinking. You feel tired, confused, even warm. People have been known to remove their own clothes in the final stages, completely unaware they're freezing to death. Then there's the terrain. This wasn't paved land. It was rough, uneven, unpredictable ground filled with hazards, sharp rocks, sudden drops, unstable river crossings. One wrong step, one misjudged path, and you could break an ankle miles away from anyone who could help. And a broken ankle out there, that's not an injury, that's a death sentence. Because if you can't move, you can't find food, you can't find water, you can't escape predators, you're stuck waiting for something else to finish the job. Speaking of predators, the Wild West wasn't empty. It was full of animals that were stronger, faster, and far better adapted to survive than you. Wolves hunted in packs. Mountain lions stalked silently from above. Bears didn't just threaten you, they dominated entire regions. And unlike in modern times, there were no protections, no boundaries, no systems in place to keep you safe. You were in their world. And even the smaller threats were dangerous. Snakes hiding under rocks, scorpions in your boots, insects carrying disease. A single bite or sting could lead to infection, paralysis, or worse, especially with no real medical treatment available. Even your food wasn't safe. Hunting required skill you probably didn't have. And if you did manage to catch something, you had to preserve it quickly, or it would rot. There was no refrigeration, no safe storage. Meat spoiled fast, especially in the heat, turning into another potential source of deadly illness. And farming? That was a gamble against the weather. Drought could wipe out crops completely. Floods could destroy everything overnight. Locust swarms. Yes, entire clouds of insects could descend and strip fields bare in hours, leaving nothing behind. Imagine working for months, only to lose everything in a single afternoon. That wasn't rare. That was life. The truth is, survival in the Wild West wasn't about strength or bravery. It was about endurance against a constant, overwhelming pressure from every direction: heat, cold, hunger, thirst, injury, and exhaustion. There was no break, no safe zone, no moment where you could relax and feel secure, because the environment itself was always waiting for you to make one mistake. And eventually, you would. Even if you managed to avoid disease, violence, and the brutal elements, there was still one silent killer waiting patiently: hunger. Not the mild, passing hunger you feel after skipping a meal, not the kind you fix with a quick snack. This was something deeper. A slow, grinding emptiness that ate away at your body and mind until there was nothing left. Food in the Wild West was never guaranteed. Out on the frontier, supply chains didn't exist the way they do now. There were no supermarkets, no refrigeration, no reliable storage systems. Everything you ate had to be grown, hunted, traded, or transported over long, dangerous distances. And most of the time, something went wrong. Crops failed, droughts would stretch on for months, baking the soil until it cracked open. Seeds wouldn't sprout. Fields turned into dust. Families who depended on those crops didn't just lose income, they lost their entire food supply. And when rain did come, it often came too hard. Flash floods could wipe out entire harvests overnight. One storm, one river overflowing, and months of work vanished. No backup, no insurance, just loss. Then came pests. Locust swarms weren't just a biblical story. They were a real and devastating threat. Massive clouds of insects would descend on farmland and consume everything in their path. Leaves, stems, crops, gone within hours. Farmers could do nothing but watch. And if you weren't farming, you were hunting. Which sounds simple until you realize how difficult it actually was. Hunting required skill, patience, and knowledge of the land. Miss a shot and you wasted precious ammunition. Track the wrong animal and you could end up lost or worse, injured. And even if you succeeded, you had to process the meat immediately. Because meat didn't last, without refrigeration, it spoiled quickly, especially in the heat. Salt curing and smoking helped, but those methods required time, resources, and experience. If done wrong, the food became just as dangerous as eating nothing at all. So people relied heavily on preserved staples: dried beans, flour, salted pork. Simple, repetitive, often lacking in essential nutrients, which led to another problem: malnutrition. You might have enough calories to survive, but not enough vitamins to stay healthy. Conditions like scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, were common. Gums would bleed, teeth would loosen and fall out, wounds wouldn't heal, your body would slowly break down from the inside. And then there were the wagon trains. Thousands of people moving westward, carrying limited supplies across vast, unforgiving distances. Every decision mattered: how much food to bring, how fast to travel, when to ration. And many got it wrong. Supplies ran out, animals died, food spoiled. And when that happened, desperation set in. Rations were cut, meals became smaller, less frequent, hunger turned into weakness, weakness turned into vulnerability, and vulnerability in a place like the frontier was fatal. There are accounts of families surviving on little more than scraps: boiled leather, foraged plants, whatever they could find just to stay alive one more day. Imagine waking up every morning knowing there might not be enough food to make it to the next. That wasn't fear. That was reality. Even in towns, food scarcity was a constant issue. Deliveries could be delayed for weeks or months. Prices would skyrocket. What little food was available became a luxury many couldn't afford. And hunger doesn't just affect the body, it affects the mind. It makes you irritable, desperate, reckless. It clouds your judgment. People made bad decisions when they were starving, dangerous decisions that often led them straight into even worse situations. So now, think about everything stacked against you: contaminated water, constant disease, violent, unpredictable encounters, a deadly environment, and now no reliable food. At this point, survival isn't just difficult, it's statistically unlikely. Because hunger doesn't kill you quickly, it waits, it weakens you, and then it lets everything else finish the job. Section 7. Isolation, fear, and the psychological collapse. But maybe the most overlooked killer of all wasn't physical, it was mental. The Wild West wasn't just dangerous, it was isolating in a way that's hard to even imagine today. No phones, no internet, no instant communication. If you were out on the frontier, you were cut off completely. Towns were often miles, sometimes days apart. If something went wrong, there was no quick way to call for help. You couldn't send a message instantly. You had to physically travel through all the dangers we've already talked about, just to reach another human being. And sometimes, there was no one else. Homesteaders lived in extreme isolation. Families would settle on plots of land with nothing but open space around them, no neighbors, no community, just silence. Endless, heavy silence. Days blurred together, the same routines, the same struggles, the same uncertainty. And over time, that kind of isolation starts to do something to your mind. It wears you down. Loneliness in that environment wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. It led to anxiety, depression, and in many cases, complete psychological breakdown. There are recorded cases of what was called prairie madness. People, especially those living in extreme isolation, would begin to experience severe mental distress. Panic attacks, hallucinations, emotional instability. Some became withdrawn, others became unpredictable, and some didn't recover at all. Imagine living every day with constant threats, disease, hunger, violence, while also feeling completely alone. No support system, no escape, no reassurance that things would get better. Because sometimes, they didn't, and fear was constant. Not the quick, sharp fear of a sudden danger, but a low, persistent dread that never really left. Every sound at night could be something. Every stranger could be a threat. Every illness could be the one that kills you. You didn't get to relax. You didn't get to feel safe. Your mind was always on edge. And over time, that kind of stress changes you. It makes you jumpy, paranoid, exhausted. It affects your decisions, your reactions, your ability to think clearly. And in a place where one bad decision could cost your life, that's all it takes. Even children weren't spared from this. Growing up in such harsh conditions meant facing adult-level stress from an early age. Loss, danger, responsibility. It all came early and it came fast. There was no real concept of mental health support, no understanding of trauma. People just endured until they couldn't. So when we talk about why you wouldn't last 10 seconds in the Wild West, it's not just about your body failing. It's about your mind breaking under pressure. Because survival isn't just physical, it's psychological. And in a world that offers you no comfort, no safety, and no certainty, even the strongest minds begin to crack. There's one last illusion about the Wild West that needs to be shattered. People think lawless means freedom. It doesn't. It means vulnerability. Because when there's no system strong enough to protect you, everything becomes uncertain. Justice isn't guaranteed, safety isn't expected, and survival depends less on what's right and more on who's stronger, faster, or simply more ruthless. Out on the frontier, law enforcement was thin, inconsistent, and often unreliable. A town might have a sheriff, or it might not. And even if it did, that sheriff wasn't backed by a trained force, modern equipment, or any real infrastructure. Most of the time, it was just one man trying to control an entire town filled with armed, desperate people. And that rarely worked. Crime wasn't always punished. Sometimes it wasn't even investigated. If something happened to you, robbery, assault, even murder, there was a very real chance nothing would come of it. No witnesses, no evidence, no follow-up, just silence. And if justice did come, it wasn't always justice as you'd understand it. It was often mob justice. Vigilante groups would form quickly, driven by anger, fear, or rumor. Trials were rushed or non-existent. Decisions were made in minutes. Punishments were immediate and often irreversible. Hangings could happen the same day, and not always to the right person. All it took was suspicion, being in the wrong place, looking like the wrong kind of person, saying the wrong thing to the wrong crowd. There were no safeguards, no appeals, no second chances. And if you thought you could rely on the system to protect your rights, there wasn't really a system to begin with. Even property wasn't secure. Land disputes were common, and they weren't settled in courtrooms, they were settled with force. If someone wanted what you had, and they had more power or more allies, they could take it. And you couldn't do much about it, because again, no backup. You were responsible for your own protection. Which sounds empowering until you realize what that actually means. It means constant vigilance. It means sleeping lightly, always alert. It means carrying a weapon not for show, but because you genuinely might need it at any moment, and even then, it might not be enough, because the people around you were living under the same pressure. Fear makes people unpredictable. Scarcity makes people desperate, and desperation makes people dangerous. So trust was rare. Strangers weren't just strangers, they were potential threats. Every interaction carried risk. Every deal could turn into a conflict. Every misunderstanding could escalate. You weren't part of a stable society. You were part of a fragile, shifting environment where order could break down instantly, and when it did, you were on your own. Extended ending, you were never meant to survive. So now, step back and look at the full picture. You wake up in the Wild West. Before you've even had your first meal, you're already surrounded by threats. The water could poison you. The air carries disease. The food might not be safe. The people around you might turn violent. The environment is actively working against you. And if anything goes wrong, there's no one coming to help. That's not an exaggeration. That's the reality. You wouldn't last 10 seconds, not because you're weak, but because the system itself is stacked against you in ways you're not built to handle. Modern life has quietly trained you to expect safety, clean water, reliable food, medical care, law enforcement, communication, stability. Remove all of that, and what you're left with is something raw, unpredictable, and unforgiving. The Wild West wasn't a playground for heroes, it was a pressure cooker. And only a small number of people, through a mix of luck, resilience, and sheer endurance, managed to survive it, not thrive, not conquer, just survive. And even they paid a price: shorter lives, constant hardship, loss that became routine, a world where death wasn't shocking, it was expected. So when you imagine yourself stepping into that world, ask yourself honestly, how long would you really last? Not in a duel, not in a movie scene, but in the reality of it. Because the truth is, you wouldn't even make it past the first sip of water, the first breath of dust, or the first night alone in a place where everything is trying to kill you. Final outro, high retention, viral CTA style. The Wild West wasn't deadly because of guns. It was deadly because everything else was worse. The real enemy wasn't the outlaw standing across from you. It was the invisible, unstoppable force surrounding you every second you were alive. And now I want to know, what would get you first? The disease, the hunger, the violence, or the isolation? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more brutal reality checks like this, where history isn't romanticized, it's exposed, make sure you subscribe to Heritage Depth. Because the past wasn't just different, it was far more dangerous than you've ever been told. So, why wouldn't you last 10 seconds in the Wild West? It's not because you aren't quick on the draw, it's because in the first 10 seconds, you would have taken a breath full of pulverized, dried waste. You would have stepped into a world that had no concept of the microscopic predators lying in wait on every surface, in every cup, and in every drop of water. The great myth of the West focuses on the dramatic conflict between men. But the true, relentless, and far deadlier conflict was between humanity and the microbial world. The real gunfight was against germs. A cowboy was far more likely to be felled by dysentery from a camp meal than by a rustler's bullet. A family crossing the plains had more to fear from their own water barrel than from any hostile encounter. Disease was the #1 killer on the trail by a wide margin. The story of the Wild West isn't a story of heroes and villains, it's a story of survival. It's a testament to the resilience of people who face down not just an untamed land, but the constant, invisible threat of diseases that struck with terrifying speed. The true conquerors of the West weren't the gunslingers. They were the ones who, through sheer luck and an unimaginable tolerance for hardship, simply managed to wake up alive each morning. The next time you watch a Hollywood Western, remember the reality hiding just beneath the dust and drama. Remember the smell, the sickness, and the overwhelming odds. The deadliest thing in the Wild West wasn't a smoking gun, it was a silent glass of water. What part of this brutal reality surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments below.